Today, Syria is often seen through a lens of conflict and collapse, but just over a century ago, Greater Syria was prosperous and politically assertive. Cities like Beirut and Damascus were focal points for a reform-minded national movement spreading across the Ottoman Arab world. Then, by the mid-1920s, Syria was solidly and abruptly French. So how did that happen? Why was France so determined to rule Syria? How did the Syrians try to resist? And how did the French use sectarian divides to control their very unhappy new mandate? How did France colonize Syria? Well, the history of France in Syria, and also Lebanon, is inextricably linked to the broader Arab world, the demise of the once mighty Ottoman Empire, and to the other great player in the age of imperialism, Britain. Until World War I, historic Greater Syria had been ruled by the Ottoman sultans for about 400 years, but by 1914 the Ottoman state was on its last legs. Its provinces had been successively seized by Europeans, France included, or lost to nationalist independence movements. With London and Paris in the lead, the empire's economy had been taken over by European capital, and Ottoman attempts at reform had only put off their decay. The French first arrived on the Syrian coast in 1919 under the command of General Henri Gouraud, a committed colonialist who had previously fought in French North Africa. Gouraud led the French presence in Syria through its formative years. By 1919, the Ottomans were beaten, and the French forces sent to Syria took over from occupying British imperial troops. France's ally Britain had fought the Ottomans between 1915 and 1918. They had incited the Great Arab Revolt against Constantinople, allying with the Sharif of Mecca and his sons, and by the time the Ottomans sued for peace, British and Sharifian armies had virtually driven them from the Levant. Meanwhile, the French were busy elsewhere, but the two European states had secretly made rough plans to divide the Ottoman Middle East in the 1916 Sykes-Picot Agreement, and ultimately historic Syria was to be partitioned between them. Paris had commercial interests in Syria and Lebanon dating back to Ottoman-era concessions. The French saw themselves as protectors of the Middle East's Christian population, especially the Maronite Catholics of Mount Lebanon, many of whom enthusiastically supported French rule over inclusion in a Muslim-majority Arab Syria. France also didn't want Britain to completely dominate the Middle East, for matters of prestige and access to oil. But Britain had hedged her bets in 1916. With British encouragement, Sharif Hussein of Mecca, a leader of the powerful Arab Hashemite clan, kicked off a nationalist revolt against the Ottoman Empire in Arabia. By October 1918, in territory claimed by France, Britain's other ally, Faisal, the son of Hussein, had established an administration based in Damascus. Faisal laid claim to an Arab Kingdom of Syria, which he hoped to extend across modern Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, and Palestine. The Hashemites envisioned a united, formerly Ottoman Arab world ruled by Hussein and his sons. Based on correspondence between the Sharif, who ruled Islam's most holy city, and Sir Henry McMahon, the British High Commissioner to Egypt, the Hashemites believed they had British backing for their project. In reality, their letters are much more nuanced than a blank promise. But in a martial atmosphere, both sides conjured up liberal interpretations of the terms of their alliance. By November 1918, the so-called Sharifian solution, as presented by T.E. Lawrence to the British cabinet, would have seen Hussein rule the Hejaz region and Faisal allowed to be king in most of modern Syria, with only small concessions to the French. Two issues complicated matters. Firstly, Britain had no intention of letting Palestine in southern Greater Syria out of her grasp. The Holy Land was a prize in itself, and the 1917 Balfour Declaration had committed London to supporting a Jewish homeland there. Then there were the imperial pretensions of France, which stood directly in competition with Arab ambitions. Through 1919, the French and Faisal's government stood in a diplomatic stalemate, maneuvering through negotiations at the broader Paris peace conferences. That changed at the San Remo Conference in April 1920, when the major Allied powers, Britain, France, Italy, and Japan, decreed that beyond the Kingdom of Hejaz, the Ottoman Middle East would be divided into League of Nations mandates. Two covered Palestine and Mesopotamia under British auspices. Already, that represented modifications to the original Sykes-Picot Agreement. Britain's post-war preeminence in the Middle East let them pressure France into recognizing British influence in oil-rich northern Iraq and control of Palestine. Faisal hoped they would do the same for his Syrian state. Britain did not. On balance, the French were a far more important ally to appease. The Mandate for Syria and Lebanon established by San Remo gave France legal free rein to assert control over Syria. It held the Syria-Lebanon Mandate from the early 1920s until those countries gained independence after World War II. The thinking went that certain places were not ready to rule themselves, and so should be guided by civilized powers for the time being. That sounded a lot better than "we'll fly our flag and take their stuff." For France on the ground in Syria, there was still some taking to be done. Faisal's Sharifian army had entered Damascus in October 1918, and as negotiations with Paris and General Gouraud faltered, he was proclaimed King of Syria by an Arab Congress in March 1920. But Damascus controlled less than half of its claimed territory, and Faisal was in a weak domestic position. The UK had originally supported his regime, but acknowledged Syria as being within the French sphere after San Remo. The war had caused economic chaos, and strapped for resources, the Arab Kingdom lacked the capacity to organize a strong resistance to France. Faisal's state struggled to maintain basic order. Syria's major cities became overcrowded with rural refugees and Armenians who had been forced south by the Ottomans. He imposed compulsory military service and increased taxes to steady the ship, but in doing so sapped at the popular legitimacy of his Syrian project. It didn't help that while he was an Arab, Faisal was not a Syrian. The Hashemite pan-Arabism, sold by a man who, to many Damascene elites, was an uncouth Bedouin from the desert, didn't always land. As the French layered on, Faisal's Syria began to collapse in 1920. He tried to compromise with Paris, immediately had to backtrack in the face of domestic uproar, and was eventually driven from Damascus by the French at the Battle of Maysalun in July 1920. Right away, the French turned to a strategy of divide and rule, carving up their mandate along sectarian lines, and as such, modern Syria was born in an atmosphere racked by uncertainty, suspicion, and betrayal. The south of Greater Syria became British Mandatory Palestine and the Emirate of Transjordan, ruled by Faisal's brother Abdullah under British patronage. Syria now referred to this under France. As High Commissioner, Henri Gouraud served as the Mandate's highest legal authority. To counter Syrian and Arab nationalism, he split Syria into several sort of self-governing indigenous states. Lebanon was the only area that Paris successfully kept separate in the long term. In 1925, a revolt in the Druze Mountains spread to Damascus and became a general anti-French, pro-independence movement. The Syrian Revolution remains a defining moment in the Syrian national consciousness. The French bowed to the pressure, and the Damascus and Aleppo states were merged, becoming the first Syrian republic in 1930. It was led by a native government, subject to the French High Commissioner, and increasingly demanded more autonomy. The Republic was allowed to annex the Druze and Alawite states in 1936, and modern Syria's borders were finalized in 1939, when Alexandretta was ceded to Turkey over loud Syrian Arab protests. After France fell during World War II, the collaborationist Vichy French regime retained control of the mandates. A British and Free French invasion in 1942 put an end to that, and Syria and Lebanon became independent, over the grumblings of the Free French leader Charles de Gaulle. 15 years later, de Gaulle led France through the loss of its prized colony, Algeria. To find out more about French imperialism in the Arab world, you should check out the video on l'Algérie française to the left. Hopefully, I'll see you there. And as always, I've been James, and thanks for watching Look Back History.